Hey all, and welcome back in. Well, here we are, episode number 3 of the Little Big Tank, the 1/16th scale FT17. Yep, a small vehicle, but big on my bench because, well, it's 1/16th scale. In the last episode, well, we took care of the camouflage painting. If you missed that, head on back to episode number 2. You can catch up, and we'll wait for you right here. I have to admit that I had a really good time painting that camouflage. It was quite fun. It might have been a little intimidating to start off with, but it was a lot of fun in the end. And when I finished up, well, we ended up with something that looks, well, exactly like these photos right here. So now we're ready to start the next chapter, and this will be all about the weathering. So because, again, this is such a large model that this is going to be done in sections. I'll have to break it down into small sections. And once we get done with this episode, well, we'll have basically the running gear finished. All of that is just a kind of a roundabout long way of saying, well, we're going to take that clean paint job and we're going to spend some time and mess it up. Okay, let's get started. If you remember from the last episode and part of the painting process, I added layers of hairspray because of the eventuality that, maybe down the line someplace I'd like to do some chipping. Well, in fact, yes, I do want to do some chipping, but the activation of the hairspray really wasn't working, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Probably the most basic reason is that the layers of paint that I put over the hairspray were way too thick. So I was really having a difficult time breaking through the surface. So that's why I used the tip of my knife just to kind of scratch and break the surface a little bit so the water could get underneath a little bit and cause a little bit of chipping. In the end, this is basically the only chipping I did. I was just a little bit on the lower hull here. I think it added just a nice touch, but I didn't really feel like fighting this over the entire vehicle. So we'll weather it in other ways and chip it in different ways. Of course, next thing to do before we get too carried away here is just add a few decals. There's not many decals on this little tank. Those are just set in place directly over the paint using a little bit of Mr. Mark's softener and setter. And before we really jump into the weathering, just need to take care of a few details here, paint those out. Alrighty then, let's get started. Well, I'm going to start off with, like I generally do, with oil paints. Process is exactly the same as I used on all these other projects, where I'll generally profile out areas using a lighter color. In this case, it's light mud, and I'll come back with a darker color to add a little bit deeper, richer stains and dirt marks. Of course, there's other colors on that palette as well, the greens, the reds, and the yellows, and I'll use those along with and in conjunction with the earth colors. And those colors, the brighter colors, those work really well to add depth of color and richness to all these different patterns, the camouflage patterns. So you'll see this as we go along. I'll just start tapping into those every once in a while as well. Small recap on the technique, just add the color with a brush, very little thinner on those colors as they go onto the model, and then come back with a clean brush. It's kind of stipple motion and just kind of work it into the finish. And you can see I'm always unloading that brush that I'm stippling, so it's almost a paint removal process half the time. This is going to be all about weathering. We're just going to let the camera roll throughout this entire, basically the whole thing here, so you're going to see it from beginning to end. While this is in the background, let me talk a little bit about where I think that we need to move with this model. Again, it has to do with scale. So oftentimes, most of the times, on 1/35th scale, for instance, when I work with the oil paints and do the weathering, that can be the last step. There's enough, the color in of itself is enough to give the illusion of dirt and grease and grime and things like that. My concern, and it'll bear out a little bit later, you'll see this, as we move up in scale, so as it gets bigger, the effects have to become more realistic, not symbolic, but actual. We have to have the texture to go along with the color. And so as this goes through and we start moving our way through the weathering here, you'll see as I start adding more and more different materials, pigments and acrylic pastes and things like that in order to actually add texture and bulk to the finish. But for now, we'll continue with the oil paints, just adding, really, this is the base layer now. So this will be the opening layers of weathering. And even though we'll do a lot of weathering over the top of it, this is the basis of it all. A lot of this will show through. It'll just become more subtle and not quite the focal point. And not to worry, I was working on both sides, the left and the right, at the same time. So here's a little quick recap of the other side. Same process, using the oil paints to add that first initial base layer to what will be the weathering on the model, profiling some of those surface details, all with the oil paints, generally adding that lighter color first, coming back in, blending them back out, and often rinse and repeat over and over and over again. It's about now that I'm coming to the conclusion that there needs to be more. I've done pretty much everything I can do with the oil paints. I can't bulk it up anymore. I can't literally add texture. I can only add the colors. And so I decided, well, let's pull back. Let's add a few of these extra details. So I polished up the road wheels. There's this really nice Renault plate on the side, little brass plate. Gave that a little bit of a brass acrylic color, and then come back in over the top with clear orange. It doesn't look so bad. But again, it's at about this time where I start looking at this section. I'm going like, it just needs more. It's dirty, yes, but it doesn't have that bulk. It doesn't have those textures that I'm looking for. So let's start addressing textures now in this next area. This is that special moment when I get to say thank you to my Patreon. If you enjoy this channel and would like to support it further, I do have a Patreon page. I'd love to see you over there. The link is in the description below. Over there, you'd find early viewing of these videos, special feature videos, progress photographs. We have a Discord server for chat. I hope to see you there. So when I think of textures, I think of pigments. That's my first go-to. And I've done a little bit of research behind the scenes here. These two colors match very, very closely with the colors of oil paint that I've already been using. So that's very important to be consistent with the different weathering mediums. Now, in terms of application, this is a little trick. I don't know how tricky this is, but this is something that I like to use, especially when I'm trying to bulk things up. I'll start out actually with the oil paint. So I'll add the oil paint into the area where I want to add the pigments. And then I'll take the dry pigment and just stipple it into and over the top of that little bare section of oil paint. What we're doing here is a couple of things. One, we're unifying the oil paint and the pigment colors together now. And secondly, it becomes the fixer. The oil paints become the fixer because now as that dries, this isn't going anywhere. So this will all stay there. In terms of the application, it's very similar to how you would use the oil paints. So you can just add that first layer of color, in the case of the lighter color, the light mud, come back in over the top of it with a little bit of the darker pigments, the same as you would with a darker oil paint. Same process. The thing that I like about this is that I can be very, very precise as to where I start bulking up the texture in this case, or application of the pigment. So wherever I add oil paints, this is where the pigment is going to stay. So far, this application has only been concentrated on these vertical surfaces, the sides of the running gear here. And that's working out great. I've got a little bit of texture going on there, a little bit of bulk built up because of the pigments and the oil paint together. But on these horizontal surfaces, there's going to be a lot of mud and dirt accumulated here because basically the tracks run over the top of this area, and so all the mud and stuff just drops onto this. For this, I want to add even more texture, more bulk. And so my first stop is I'm going to add pigment fixer across this entire surface, and then I'm going to be just using a nice soft brush, just kind of add some pigment onto it and just drop it into or over the top of the pigment fixer. And this way the fixer kind of soaks into the pigment, but the coarseness, the little grains of pigment, all stay nice and complete. So we're starting to add a first level of bigger dirt clods. And then as I move through the process here, I can continue to manipulate the color by adding, well, it's basically just a wash now of the oil paints just into certain areas here. Just let that flow across. And again, that is just a matter of trying to keep all these colors of the pigments and the oils and all those nice and consistent. And after our rounds of pigments and pigment fixers, this is where we are. And it's looking good, but I still don't feel like we're there. It's a little bit too clean for a World War I trench situation here. So I need to do something more across those top edges here. Well, to get to this added bulk, I'm going to turn to the acrylic terrains paste, and this is natural earth. And what that really means is that it has texture, but it has no color. And you recall I've used some with the color to, especially use it on my diorama bases and other projects. This will allow me to, use the pigments and dump those into this and tint this acrylic paste to exactly the same colors as I've been using throughout. And if that wasn't quite enough texture, I'll add a little bit of this cut twine. We'll mix that into the paste just to represent some dry grass that might be caught up in there. Now I can take my paste, it's got the proper color, and I can start bulking up on certain areas. This is where restraint needs to really be key. This is the less is more area of the weathering here. I'm very conservative, very precise as to where I'm adding this paste. I think the go-to would be just to slop this on everywhere, call it a dirty tank, and be done with it. I don't want to do that. I've already added all these layers of weathering, be it through the oils or the pigments and the oils together. This is just to add a little bit of extra bulk. So it's fairly precise, not trying to overdo it here, but it is giving me that feeling of dirt and accumulation that I'm looking for. Once we have the paste in place, then it's back to that kind of same rinse and repeat sort of formula here, where we can add a little bit of oil paint or even pigments over the top of this and make sure everything starts looking all nice and together and harmonious. There's a big word. And it all starts coming together into one cohesive weathered mess, I guess. Dirty, weathered mess. Well, these are kind of the final steps on these areas here, and I think you could kind of watch this and imagine how this all gets finished out. And we'll show some pictures here in just a few seconds. This has been a lot of fun. As I've mentioned a number of times by now, moving up scales, so 1/16 is so much larger than my usual 1/35 that I've really had to kind of rethink a little bit about how I address the weathering. Not only is it the color, again, it is the textures as well, and how to best represent mud and dirt and dust and all those sort of things in a larger scale. Again, we're kind of looking more towards realism than symbolism here, or representative of dust and dirt. I hope you enjoyed this. We took a deep dive on this. Of course, we've got a lot more to do on this model. Looking forward to that. If you haven't done so already and you like this channel, please hit that subscribe button. I also have a Patreon page. The link for that is in the description below. Come over and join us over there. Yep. Yes, we still have lots to do. We have tracks to build. We have models to weather. We have all sorts of things yet to come. So I'm hoping you're enjoying this. Like I said, a lot to do, but it's a lot of fun. So until the next time, guys, happy modeling.